My name is Mel Cole, and this afternoon we're going to be making a couple different Instant Pot recipes because that was one of the most requested programs through the library. We've got two different sizes. I have a 3-quart that we'll be doing an apple crisp in, and I've got a 6-quart that I'm going to do a Texas brisket chili. And brisket being a really tough cut of meat, the pressure cooker works marvelously for that. First thing I'm going to do, get the brisket. Now this is not a whole brisket. What I did is I got a 6-pound, little over 6.5-pound brisket flat. If you don't know what that is, just go to the grocery store and ask your friendly neighborhood meat counter person to get a brisket flat. And then I cut it into thirds, thinking 2 pounds would be just about right for a 6-quart pot. And so, not wanting to cut it up in advance, I wanted to come here, and so you can see, yes, it's a little messy, but brisket is wonderful when it's cooked, and this recipe works really well for actually just using just straight brisket. There's no water added. We'll use the water right out of a can of crushed can of tomatoes. What we're going to do is we're going to cut this brisket into pieces. Excuse me. Okay. You want to cut the brisket into bite-sized pieces. So whatever for you is a bite-sized piece, might be 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch. And if one piece has a lot of fat, I may just trim some of that fat off. I want to leave some of the fat because that's where a lot of the flavor is in the brisket. Then what we're going to do is we're going to briefly saute. We're not real interested in getting it really brown, but we do want to brown it somewhat, and we'll use the saute section of the Instant Pot. And this works really great if you've got a really sharp knife. You can see how easy it cuts through. If I put it all the way to the bottom, it does. There we go. Be careful not to cut your hand because that always hurts. I'll probably get part of this cut, turn the Instant Pot on, and start the saute process while I continue to cut the rest of the brisket up. But I don't want to get too far ahead. I want to just kind of do it in sections. The thing about the brisket chili is it's really quite simple. Just for this recipe, it's just the meat, you brown it, then I'll add some onions and peppers. Peppers are your choice. I've got poblanos and jalapenos. That's going to give you I won't say real spicy, but a mild spice. And then we'll be adding some chili powder at each step along the way. If jalapenos are too spicy for you, just leave them out. You could use a poblano. That's a very, very mild chili pepper. It's the poblano is a green version of ancho chili, which is the chilies that are in chili powder. So it works perfectly well with this particular recipe. And if that's still too spicy for you, then you can do it without peppers, or you could just do green or red bell peppers. This probably is going to be just about right to get that first set going. Now, where do you go to get recipes for the Instant Pot? Well, Instant Pot, they have a number of great recipes themselves. You can go to the internet and Google Instant Pot recipes. You want to be careful to ensure that of the size that they use. If they don't, I would stick with the 6-quart pot. So let's get this. The Instant Pot's right behind me. I'm just going to take it over, dump it in. It's about right. Then I always start by canceling everything, and then you want to do a saute. Down here at the bottom, it automatically gives you a 30-minute. This particular version gives you 30 minutes. That's probably not going to need all of it. Now, there we go. It's on. One thing I do at every stage when I'm adding either protein or I'm adding the vegetables or the tomatoes, I'm going to add chili powder. Now, I make my own chili powder, and I grind various chilies together with Mexican oregano, smoked paprika, cumin, little garlic and onion powder. And I'll put this in at each stage, because what that does, make sure it gets coated here, is that builds layer upon layer of flavor. And that's the thing you really want to do in any of this, whether you do this recipe with brisket in the Instant Pot, you could do chuck the same way. Chuck you could do in the Instant Pot. You probably wouldn't have to cook it as long, because chuck doesn't need quite as long a cook time. You could do chuck in a crock pot. And every time you do it, you just do layer upon layer. Every time you add something in. Now, the beauty of the Instant Pot is it's one pot. I'm not going to take it out. I'm just going to keep adding stuff in until we have a pot full of chili. Then I'll let it build up to pressure. And we'll let it cook for 45 minutes. We'll let it self-release for about 15. Then we'll do an instant release. And then when that is cooking, we'll do an apple crisp using 3 different kinds of apples with cinnamon and other spices. If I'm doing my normal chili recipe, I use about 2 tablespoons, maybe 2.5 per pound of meat. Now, that varies. With this recipe, there's no beans. Now, I don't know how many of you are watching this that might be from Texas, but from what I have heard, chili in Texas doesn't have beans. And if any of you are fans of the Big Bang Theory, Sheldon, he's the genius on the show. He's from Texas, and they served him chili, and it had beans in it. He says, I don't know what this is, but it's not chili. It's good, but it's not chili. So, as an homage to Texans, this is called Texas brisket chili, because there are no beans. Now, if you want beans, I would just add a can or 2 of your favorite beans. And with this, I would probably go ahead and add all the liquid also. Now this brisket, of course, I did buy fresh, and I did freeze it, and this is actually the 3rd part of that 6.5 pound flat. when I made the second batch, it was frozen. Didn't notice a difference at all in the taste or the texture or anything like that, so it froze very well. Okay. All right, just browning nicely. Now, I have a whole onion that I'm going to put in, and I'm going to show you, use a different surface here for the onion. Never cross-contaminate between beef or raw foods and your vegetables, which is why something like this with multiple cutting boards is nice to do. Also, use a different knife. And I'm going to rinse off my hands real quick. Okay, some of you may want to know how to slice an onion. And you're not real comfortable with, you've probably seen all the chefs on TV doing a horizontal slice. To get the same kind of dice, I have halved it and then I've quartered it. And I come in and I just do 1/4 inch, 1/3 inch cuts, rotate it 90 degrees, and then I just chop this way. And again, have a very sharp knife. Some people might be a little concerned about really sharp knives. Don't, because you're more likely to cut yourself on a dull knife than a sharp knife. Okay, I'm just going to add this right into the Instant Pot with the remainder of the onions. Add a little more chili powder. Now the onions are starting to sweat a little bit, which will take up some of the fond that the browning of the beef left on the bottom of the pan, and that's going to add more flavor back into the chili. Okay, what we have here is we have some poblanos and a little bit of jalapeno. Now with jalapenos, one thing is if you like them but don't want them real hot, remove all the seeds. This is a poblano. You can tell by the really dark green. A standard bell pepper will be closer to this green. You just want to remove the seeds of the poblano, and you would do the same thing with a jalapeno if you didn't want it as spicy. Now, if you want it spicy, leave the seeds in. Okay, and we're just going to slice it again, about the same size slice as you did with the onions. Just run your knife through it. Okay, the meat's nice and brown. The onions are starting to sweat a little bit. The last thing is a can. Now, what kind of tomatoes you use is up to you. I use petite diced tomatoes because they tend to be about the same size as the pieces of vegetable that I just cut, either the green beans, either the peppers or the onions. And this, since you do need some liquid in the Instant Pot, the whole can. A couple more teaspoons of the powder on the tomatoes. Stir it up well. To bring everything together, I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of salt. And some black pepper, however much you like. I always use freshly ground because pepper will stay fresher in a whole container that it is. Okay. Okay, clear your Instant Pot, turn it off. Put the lid on. Let's see. Want to select pressure cook. We want high and we want 45 minutes. So you just need to increase till you get 45. Make sure that the vent is to, and I have to turn this around just a minute to read it here. Let me back. Okay. There. It's now on, and when it starts to come up to pressure, that's when your timer will start. So it could take a few minutes to come up to pressure. Hang on. Didn't add all of the rest of the peppers. Just a little more. Now we're ready. Okay, so that is the prep time, and the rest of it's just going to sit here. It's probably going to take 15 to 20 minutes to come up to pressure. Then you got 45. Then you'll release it, let it release. When it starts counting back down, about 15 minutes, then whatever's left, you can just vent it immediately. Okay, I'm going to do a little wash up here, and we'll get on to the apple crisp in the smaller pot. Welcome back. We're going to now start the dessert portion, and this is going to be an apple crisp. Now, again, like I said, you could Google recipes and everywhere else. This is the recipe, and I'm sure we'll find a way to have these posted online when the talk actually happens. This recipe originated with centercutcook.com. So anytime I pull one off the internet, I like to acknowledge that, and then, as you can see from my chicken scratchings, I do a lot of alterations to it. Now, the one thing I can say about this, the first time I made this, I used just a little bit more spice than it had, and for my wife and I, that wasn't enough. So I've added more. So try it with probably starting with this level of spice that's actually in the recipe, and then if that's not enough, then the next time you make it, add a little bit more or vary the spices. Now, what apples do you use for an apple crisp? Well, I actually went to Bon Appetit and Google, and what are the best baking apples? Well, they say Granny Smiths are always your go-to apples, which I've used for years and years. Another one they say is a wine sap. That's one from my childhood that I don't see that much anymore. A Jonagold, a Braeburn, let's see, Pink Ladies, and Honeycrisp. Now, these are all firm apples, so they're going to hold their shape. They won't cook down quite as much. If you want to vary some things, you can add a Golden Delicious or a Jonathan, which is a little softer apple. But this adds water or a liquid, and I'll go into that in a little bit later. You may want to cut that back or see how it comes out the first time, and maybe you want to just let it cool and then thicken. So all the apples, now you can core them, you can peel them. I just tend to peel my apples, and then we'll cut them up, and we will put them into bite-sized chunks, again, just like we did with the chili. Don't worry if you leave some of the skin. You don't really want to take a lot of apple off. We'll just go through and cut one up. Show you how I do one. Again with a sharp knife. Cut it in half. Then I cut it in quarters with the even side down so it's much more stable. Then you want to remove the core. Paring knife does that really well. You can cut it from two different angles, so if you're a little concerned about cutting towards yourself too much, make sure you get all the seeds out and that hard core and any remnant of stem or end blossom. Then you just want to cut the apples into chunks. Maybe we'll just slice it that way once. Just like that. That kind of chunk. Perfect for an apple crisp. Could be a little larger if you like. Do this one a little bit larger. As again with most things with Instant Pots or anything like this, it's the prep that takes the longest. Now, the apples you really don't want to do ahead of time unless you put a little lemon juice on them. Then they will stay without getting brown for a little bit of time in your refrigerator. Okay, dump this into the pot. And we have 4 more to go. Now this is a 3-quart, and this recipe will fill the 3-quart about 2/3 full, and that's about the maximum you want to do. If you're having more people over, with a 6-quart, you could probably do 10, maybe 12 apples, but I wouldn't want to do any more than that. So this recipe that we have here, you would just double that recipe. And sometimes they peel easier than others. This one is not. There we go. Like I said, it's not crucial that you get all of the skin off, but you do want to get all of the paper off. And if there's any brown spots, I'm going to cut those out. Almost forgot to peel it. I did that the last time and didn't interfere with it whatsoever. But I think it does come out with a better texture and taste if you do peel it. Because the peeling in that atmosphere can sometimes get just a little tough. Now, of course, the same recipe would probably work well just in a regular baking pan in an oven. But the thing about this is, with a lot of the Instant Pots, you don't have to worry about, oh, have I pulled the apple crisp out of the oven? Because it automatically shuts down. And most of these have a keep warm cycle, so it will keep it warm for several hours. So in a busy holiday season, you could make this in the morning and by afternoon it's ready and just sitting there waiting to be eaten. Same thing with the chili too, is it will keep warm for quite a while. And notice the apple crisp as I'm slicing it, I don't know if you can tell, but it's a little bit easier to slice through. It's not quite as dense in texture as the Granny Smith. Okay. Now, the next part of the recipe is you sprinkle in your spices, cinnamon and nutmeg. Then you top it with water and maple syrup. Well, I've already got my spice blend here that I'm going to use. This is cinnamon, nutmeg, and a little bit of apple pie spice and pie spice. So I'm just going to sprinkle it on. Now that's probably close to 4 just under 4 teaspoons. In the original recipe called for 2. So that's just a little bit more than the original recipe. Now, the next part calls for water and maple syrup. Well, some friends of ours, Marlis and Alan Arnold with Cooking with Tea, they said, why don't you try an experiment replacing a brewed tea with water? Well, since this is a apple crisp and apples and cinnamon go real well together, this is a brewed hot cinnamon spice tea with the maple syrup. So it's half a cup of liquid and a tablespoon of real maple syrup. Just pour it into the pot. Okay, the next step is the topping. And the topping, which I have pre-measured, the topping here is 3/4 cups of rolled oats, old-fashioned oats, 1/4 cup of flour, and that's all they call for it, but I added like a half a teaspoon of pie spice to the topping. Now, we want to melt some butter. We'll mix this together and then we'll drop it on the surface of that. So where's the microwave? Now what I'll do is figure out how to do this. Let's start with 20 seconds, 30 seconds. This is where they show the little clock going around. Boom, it's done. Can you tell me now how much time we have elapsed?
So 18 minutes on this segment.
Okay, the other one was probably about 20?
Yes.
That's going to work out just about right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, we have our melted butter. We're just going to pour the butter in. We're just going to stir it up. Make sure you get every little bit incorporated. Don't want any dry pieces of flour or oats. See how it's starting to come together. Just keep stirring a little bit. Get the dry pieces into the middle. You may not get, there we go. Just about got it. Here we go. So you can see now how it holds together. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop this on top of the apples that are already there. Stir in the spice just a little bit more. Yeah. Okay. Now, this is not a pretty necessarily covering. You just want to drop pieces of it in, cover as much of the surface as you can. Okay, put your lid on. Make sure it's set to sealing. You want to, each one of these has got a slightly different setting. Saute egg. Okay, pressure cook there. And that's there. Now we want to go pressure cook 8 minutes, and it will start very quickly. This will take about 10 to 15 minutes to come up to temp pressure. We cook it for 8, there we go, and it will start cooking. This timer will stop when when the seal has reached, and then that will cook for 8 minutes. We'll let that naturally release for 10 minutes. Then if there's any pressure steam left, then we'll vent it right away. Okay, and so we've got about 30 minutes left on the Texas brisket chili. We've probably got, and then add about 15 to that, so about 45 minutes here. And we've probably got about 30 minutes here before it's all done. So these will come out just about the same time, and we'll come back just before that. Okay, well, welcome back. Just to give you an idea, we started everything making the brisket, and by the time we got done with making, then we switched right into doing the apple crisp, and both of these ended up being done within 5 minutes of each other. So that's a pretty good timing thing, so you have an idea of how long it takes. Let's first taste. Let's get the brisket out. And now I did let this went about 7 or 8 minutes after it reached our time, and then I vented it. The brisket was like 12 minutes, and then I vented that on a cool down. Now I probably would have gone about, you can go a little bit longer than that, 20 minutes, and it should be very done. This will naturally vent in about 15 for this recipe. So let's take a look. Okay, this is the chili. Now, it's a nice stew consistency. Depending upon how you like it, you might want to drain some of the liquid out of the tomatoes and not put the entire can of liquid, all the liquid of the tomatoes in. But that was the only liquid we added. Didn't have to add any more liquid. And even with a plastic spoon, the brisket cuts just with a plastic spoon. You can see this. See how tender that is? Now, I am not going to eat that just yet because that's really, really hot. But I wanted to show you that to you. Now let's swing around, make sure I'm in the right spot. Do the apple crisp. And you can see here, the apples are nice and done, very tender. And the crisp, well, the one thing about this is it's not going to be as form a crust like it would in an oven because you've got that constant steam around it, but it is nice and done. So I'm going to take a taste. A little bit. There we go. A little difficult in these times to do this. Brisket melts in your mouth. It is absolutely perfect. Spice level, I'm getting a little, with the mask, I'm getting a little spice in the nose, which is kind of interesting. And it's sitting right about the back of the throat. So which is where I noticed that jalapenos hit, is kind of back here. It's very flavorful, not overly spicy. It's just a perfect brisket, and like I said, the brisket just absolutely melts in your mouth. It's kind of hard. You don't know where your mouth is, really. Almost a little too hot to taste, but definitely has the right amount of spices that I like for this. And as I said earlier, the recipe, and I want to give credit to where credit is due, www.centercutcook.com is where I pulled the recipe from. As you can see, all my little chicken scratchings are the additions that I've made. And as I said, instead of just water, we used brewed hot cinnamon spice tea. So that really pumped up the spice. Plus, I added a lot more spice because it calls for 2 teaspoons of cinnamon and a half a teaspoon of nutmeg. And I ended up using a teaspoon and a half of Vietnamese cinnamon, a teaspoon of apple pie spice, a teaspoon of pie spice, an eighth of a teaspoon of ground cloves, and just over half a teaspoon of nutmeg. So I kind of doubled that. And then I also put a half a teaspoon of pie spice in the topping. So you get a little bit of everything right there. Now, both of these, this absolutely freezes well. So we've got enough here probably for 5, maybe 8 people. And if you're not having that much, I would take, if you know you're going to eat it within about 2 weeks, I'd just put it in the refrigerator. If you know it's going to be longer than that, I'd put it in a container and freeze it. And 6 months, I wouldn't freeze it for more than 6 months, but I pulled stuff out. Now, I'm kind of a hoarder, so I've got tons of chili that I froze like 9, 10 months ago. Still good. But on an average, probably 6 months to have maximum freshness. But as you can tell, the recipe is just, this one is really simple. Cut up a brisket, cut up an onion, cut up some peppers, add the spice, can of tomatoes, close it off, and it's done. The longest thing on this is cutting the meat and cutting the vegetables. The rest of it just, you'll walk away. Same thing here. With this apple crisp, the hardest time is the prep time. Now this recipe, the recipe says prep time of 5 minutes. No, this is about 20 minutes of prep. 8 minutes to cook and another 5 to cool down. So it's about 30 to 45 minutes from the time you first start peeling your apple to the time you're ready to eat. This one is probably about 1 hour and 15 minutes from start to finish. So try those out for you. Again, this is a 3-quart, and the brisket was in a 6. If you're going to a larger one, you could probably do 4 pounds of brisket in an 8-quart, because this is about a third of the way up with 2 pounds. So I could easily probably do another pound, maybe 2 pounds here. 8 quarts would easily hold 4 pounds of brisket. This one was 5 apples, and they were good size apples, size of your fist, a little bit larger. If you're going to go any more than that, you definitely want to go to a 6-quart. And there you can go 10 to 12. With an 8-quart, you could probably go 15 apples. So depending upon what size you have. Then of course you want to adjust the other seasonings and spices. So I hope you've enjoyed our afternoon with the Instant Pot, and I look forward to the questions and answers later. Thank you very much.